I'm sorry, folks. Yeah, this guy's next door. I told you they're doing a. Look at this. I'm sorry, folks. I told you they're redoing the apartment next door, so apparently now they've got a sander coming in and doing a bunch of sanding. Hi, how are you? It is still the 30th day of October 2023. And it's still bright and early in the morning down here in beautiful Tampa, Florida. Shit is hitting the fan. Figuratively and literally. Across the world, as well as domestically, for Israel. Fingers of blame are being pointed. People are then retracting those pointed statements. Everyone is questioning how did this happen? How did our security, our vaunted security system, where we know all and see all because we're Israelis, how did that go so wrong so quickly? And of course, Bibi Netanyahu and others are all doing that Spider-Man thing with the multiple Spider-Men all standing in a circle in a parking garage pointing fingers at each other. And that's exactly what's happening. Let me share a little bit of that with you from today's news. I wanted to say real quick, if you go to Wired over here, you'll be able to find an article that's about a little under 3 weeks old. And they're talking about the fact that a lot of these, they don't mention these ideas. Maybe they do. I don't know. I didn't read the article. But maybe they mention these former IDF people who come out and say, oh, they must have let it happen on purpose because they know all, they see all. There's no way anything could get past our knowing. The IDF's intelligence agency service and the Mossad's intelligence, between the two of them, and of course Shin Bet, they would never have missed something this big. However, remember, they're former IDF and they're still pushing an idea. And the idea is, it wasn't our fault. We must have let it happen on purpose so that we could do this, which still serves the interest of Israel. Okay? Because the last thing they want are the Israeli people to know that they took the quote-unquote orcs on the other side of the fence for granted. They underestimated them and they got caught with their pants down, even with their billions of dollars worth of high-end super tech security. Wired magazine wrote an article a little under 3 weeks ago titled, Israel's failure to stop Hamas attack shows the danger of too much intelligence, or too much surveillance. Hundreds of dead, thousands wounded. Hamas's surprise attack on Israel shows the limits of even the most advanced and invasive surveillance. You see a whole bunch of this stuff here. All of this stuff. All of this focusing mostly on their failure to prevent this from happening. Over and over again, we see the word failure, even from, and expressly from, Israel First publications like The Atlantic, and in a few minutes I'll show you, the flagship of all Israel First publications in the United States, the New York Times. GIS reports, behind Israel's momentous failure, the Atlantic, how Israel adapts after failure. Times of Israel, IDF chief admits failures. Over and over again, we see the same thing. Foreign Policy magazine, Israel's military tech fetish is a failed strategy. The word failure and failed, repeated over and over and over again when talking about what happened. It is slowly creeping out that they fucked up. Meanwhile, across the world, public opinion is turning away from the victim mentality Israelis in massive numbers. all across the world, including in the United States, including Canada, including the United Kingdom. And pretty soon you're going to start seeing large ones in Israel. The reason you're not seeing any in Israel now is because right after this thing happened, they came right out and said, if you try to protest and tell us to stop fucking bombing Gaza, we'll consider you an enemy and put you on a bus and ship you over to fucking Gaza Strip. Okay? So they said your opinion doesn't matter in Israel. So much for your free speech. You don't got no free speech in Israel. They don't even have a constitution in Israel. Yes, that's a fact. The leading Israel Firster publication in the United States of America, the New York Times, how years of Israeli failures on Hamas led to a devastating attack. Israeli officials completely underestimated the magnitude of the October 7th attacks by Hamas and others, shattering the country's once invincible sense of security. Remember what Wired said. These people have this idea that their system is impenetrable. They know all. They see all because they're smarter than all. And that's why you hear people, former IDF folks, coming out and going, they must have let it happen on purpose because we know all and see all and we are so all-powerful. They're not. And they weren't. And they don't. Period. But the mythology, they started to believe their own fucking press. They started to believe their own fucking hype. And when you do that, you become complacent. You underestimate, just like the New York Times said, you underestimate the enemy. You underestimate the opposition, which is what they did. The fingers of blame pointing all over the place. This is from when? 29th, yesterday. And I think I didn't tell you the date on this. I'm sorry. This was from the 29th, on yesterday. Netanyahu finds himself at war in Gaza and at home. Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, apologized for accusing the military and security officials of lapses that led to the Hamas massacre, but declined to accept responsibility himself. Pointing fingers. Oh, he did it, you did it. Spider-Man, I'm Spider-Man, you're Spider-Man. The social media post went up at 1:10 a.m. Sunday while most Israelis were sleeping. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had a message. His military and security chiefs, he said, had failure to provide him any warning of the surprise Hamas assault on October the 7th. He appeared to be placing all the blame on them for the colossal lapses, even as Israeli forces were broadening a risky ground war in Gaza. The country woke to a furious response, including from within Mr. Netanyahu's own war cabinet. The post on X, formerly Twitter, was deleted, and the Israeli leader had to apologize in the new one. He says, I was wrong. But the damage was done. The damage was done. The damage was done. He threw his people under the fucking bus. They are fighting. They are scrapping inside. His own fucking cabinet comes out and denounces him hours after he posts that shit at 1 o'clock in the morning. Probably drunk. Maybe even high. Who knows what these people do nowadays, these fucking elites. You know they're all doing fucking Adderall and Coke. He comes out and has to apologize. But when he apologized, he doesn't take any of the blame himself. Now, this next fucking thing I'm going to share with you will show you a little bit of what I'm talking about. I've been talking about. This is a bad look for them. It's a bad look for them, which begs the question, why, of course, would they do this? Just to make themselves look worse? At a time when there's already a massive amount of internal turmoil? One thing in the favor of the people who say they let it happen on purpose, One thing in their favor is this, and this is the only thing, the only positive that I know of that came from this, because they're not going to get more land out of it. The international community is watching very carefully. They'll set the people in Gaza back a couple years in terms of the quality of their life. They'll kill a bunch of people. They'll thin the herd a bit. But in the end, they're not going to get anything out of this. Nothing. Nothing. They might kick off a regional war. In that case, they're certainly not going to get anything out of it. But the one thing they might have gotten out of it, and this is the only thing I can find that's even a positive for them, because of their stance on Supreme Court, saying that Supreme Court can no longer say, you can't fucking do that to the fucking Likudniks and the fascists running fucking Israel right now. You can't do that. You can't mandate jabs. You can't fucking go for full fucking central bank digital currency. It's against the Constitution. So they got rid of the Supreme Court's, or tried to get rid of the Supreme Court's ability to do that, which is called checks and balances, which is, of course, democracy. Half the people, more than half the people, even people in his own fucking party, Likudniks, were incensed by this. Military leaders, police leaders, business leaders, incensed by this. And that was a major sticking point and a point of conflict within Israel the last month and a half, 2 months, leading up to this. There were a number of conscripts who had said by conscience they were not going to serve their year in the IDF. There's a name for them. I forget their name, but you can look them up and find them. They, because of this, said, yep, we're all in. We're going to defend Israel in spite of this fascist trying to do a fucking Nazi power grab in Tel Aviv. We are going to sign up and defend Israel against the orc hordes. That is the only positive thing that came of this for Bibi Netanyahu. And that was a while ago, and they may, after all this, have changed their fucking minds. Especially when Bibi is throwing the head of the fucking military intelligence and throwing the head of the military under the fucking bus, saying it's their fault that they didn't see this shit coming. When scoundrels find themselves under pressure and in the public eye for the wrong reasons, you really see what kind of people these scoundrels are. You see where their fucking moral centers are. And in some cases, there is none. Surprise, surprise, Bibi Netanyahu falls in that category. Lastly, from Russia Today. So, at 1:10, he throws his people under the bus. And then a couple hours later, after massive backlash, he comes out and goes, oops, I'm sorry. Bibi Netanyahu ignored warnings from security services, says the New York Times. The officials themselves, which I believe is the rest of this article. And I'll post links to these down below, and you can find them yourself. You can read it yourself. The officials themselves also misjudged the officials themselves also misjudged the threat from Hamas, focusing instead on Iran and Hezbollah, the outlet has reported. Israeli security services warned Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu for months that his domestic policies, which I've mentioned, were fueling dangerous political turmoil, the New York Times reported on Sunday. The officials reportedly stressed that internal discord was weakening the country's security and strengthening Israel's enemies. How that strengthens the people of Gaza, I have no idea. The report was part of an examination of what led up to the latest hostilities between Israel and Gaza. At one point in July, the Prime Minister even allegedly refused to meet with the senior general that was trying to deliver a threat warning based on classified intelligence. At the same time, the New York Times assessed that Israeli security representatives themselves continually misjudged the threat posed by Hamas, including in the weeks leading up to the October 7th attack on Israeli territory, which resulted in the deaths of up to 1,400 people. Questionable, but there you go. The newspaper reported that Israeli military intelligence had believed that since May 2021 that the militant group was not interested in any large-scale attacks from Gaza, but instead plotting an attack in the West Bank where control is held by the Palestinian Authority, which is a rival to Hamas. It is also said that both Netanyahu and top Israeli security staff had underestimated the threat from Hamas and did not devote enough resources to countering it. Because they believe that Iran and Lebanese militant group Hezbollah pose more of a danger to the Jewish state. There we have it. And there it is. They become complacent. They became complacent, and as Wired shows, they became too confident in their supremacy. They became too confident in their supremacy. I gave you a fine example of fucking Colorado, and it's not me saying this. This was their coach, Deion Sanders, saying this. They were up 29 points at halftime. They go into halftime. They're feeling themselves. They're this, they're that. They come out, and next thing they know, they're down, and they end up losing that game. They became complacent. They underestimated their opponent. And they were too secure in their own supremacy, so they half-assed it. And that's what Wired's talking about. You become enamored with the security, and you think the security is impenetrable, and we see all, we know all, we are all. People are going to find ways to pick holes in it. People are going to look. People are going to figure it out. And even if all they got are bolt cutters and a couple of dirt bikes, you might find yourself with a really, really big surprise one Saturday morning. And that's exactly what happened. There's going to be a ceasefire. There's going to have to be very soon, if not next couple of days. Israel's not going to get what they wanted out of it. Basically, all he wanted was to try to look strong in the face of weakness. He didn't want the people of Israel to start asking questions like this. He didn't want the New York Times and CNN and The Atlantic and The Guardian and Der Spiegel to ask questions like this. How is it possible that the Palestinians in Gaza, with nothing, caught them sleeping, caught them with their pants down in such a way? How is that possible? Who is responsible? Ultimately, it's Bibi Netanyahu. Now, when they said in the New York Times article they ignored fucking warnings, they weren't warning specifically about October the 7th. They were warnings that, you're taking these people for granted, that they're going to be, marks. You're just going to keep taking this abuse and taking this abuse and taking. We shouldn't do that because they're Palestinians and they're resistance groups, and anything could happen. We shouldn't be taking them as lightly as we are. And that's the kind of message Bibi Netanyahu didn't want to hear. Didn't serve his interests. That's what we're talking about. And I think, the people of Israel have all the propaganda and the bullshit stories about 40 beheaded babies and running down there killing all the people and mowing down people at a fucking rave. All those lies aside. And let's just take out of the equation, they have no right to be fucking sequestering 2.3 million people in Palestine because their government wants to steal their land. So let's just take those things out of the equation and just leave us right with what happened on the 7th, the morning of the 7th, which is the enemy was able to breach the fucking walls and strike a lot of fear into the people of fucking Israel. And they, the people of Israel, who pay the taxes and vote, not on electronic voting machines, by the way, they have a right to be pissed off because the people, listen, I don't care if you're a no government person, in the end, even you say there's very limited roles for government. Primarily, even in the limited roles for government, there is one that stands out, and that is defending the fucking people. And that is what they failed to do, and somebody's going to have to be held accountable. And apparently Saturday night, doing a bunch of Adderall at 1:10 in the morning, old Bibi Netanyahu was worried about that, and he's tossing people under the bus. Shouldn't do that. Drunk tweeting, drunk texting is never a good idea. The world is watching. The world is impatient. The world is growing more impatient. More and more people are coming out, which means more and more governments are going to feel more pressure to put on fucking Israel to stop. And when that happens, just like Bibi knows, that's when the shit's really going to hit the fan in Israel. Once he's no longer a wartime prime minister, people are going to start asking for accountability. Someone's going to have to be tossed under that fucking bus. And given the situation prior to October the 7th, given the fact that he's still in trial or under investigation for criminality, Bibi might have to go. Bibi might have to go. And then ask yourself this. Could that be part of Hamas's fucking overall motive for doing it in the first place? I thank you for your time.